Welcome back, and I also want to thank you for all the interesting questions that you have sent in, and they will influence this program. We have today talked about risks and the risk complex, and we lately talked about the risk index. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the need and the possibility of global governance to mitigate these risks. And therefore, I'm very happy that I have Johanna Lissinger Peitz, who is the Swedish ambassador, and you're also the Swedish general for Stockholm Plus 50 that we will have next year. And beside me is Pelle Enarsson. You are a senior advisor at the UN Foundation, and you also have a long career in the government's office and as a Swedish diplomat. Welcome.
Thank you.
And here beside me is also Folke Tersman, who is a professor in philosophy at the Uppsala University, and you're also a deputy director at the institution for
Future Studies.
Future Studies. You have such a long, different posts that you have. But among others, you're also a board member at the Global Challenges Foundation. But with us, we also have Natalie Samarasinghe, who is head of UN UK. Last time we met, you were also an advisor in the UN 75 preparations. But now you're back in London, aren't you?
Yes, I am, and very sorry not to be on this nice sofa with your fellow panelists.
Yeah, it is a nice sofa. I might perhaps start with you, Pelle, just to see how are we a society that can handle these risks, and you are working with the UN, and I mean UN is often the hope and is often blamed, but it's I guess it's to be progressive you have to have progressive members. But can you tell us a little bit what is happening there in regards to all these risks that we have talked about this afternoon?
But thank you, Jens. I mean, this morning has been very interesting, I have to say, with all the highlights of the risks that are. But it's very easy to get scared of all these risks. There are things happening, and we need to be aware of them. Recently, the Secretary General put out a report, Our Common Agenda, and I've been part of the team that has been preparing that report. And I think that report has a very strong analysis of the risks, but it also has some very, very strong proposals on how to address those risks as a international community. We did one as a UN Foundation together with E3G and Climate Analytics. We did a base policy paper as an input to that discussion. And in that policy brief, we showcased that thanks to the cooperation that we have had on climate change, even if many of us are disappointed with the progress, but if we wouldn't have invested in that cooperation, in all that network of the science bodies, the framework convention, etc., we would have been in no chance to reach the 1.5 target today. No chance.
That is something that you seldom hear, actually.
Yeah.
Because there are mostly blames. You're not doing enough.
It's negative. But actually we can showcase, in that report we're showcasing that if we wouldn't have had any cooperation, we would be up to 4.7 degrees by the end of this year. We would already be at 2.7 degrees. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we actually do cooperate, that we have something, we have a base camp to start from. And I would like to just bring up in this debate, and I might bring up some other points tomorrow in the discussion, but today three proposals in the report from the Secretary General. He wants to strengthen the foresight capacity, the strategic foresight and risk analysis capacity within the UN. And so it's a very clear emphasis from the Secretary General to strengthen this and to bring in science into that strategic foresight. I think that needs to happen internally in the UN, and he's suggesting to establish a future lab within the UN system to use that information and to look at issues like the unknown risks that we talked about earlier. The second issue there is he is proposing to have an envoy for the future. So a very strong emphasis on future generations to bring in a perspective in our decision making, which is longer than the political periods, that stretches over the next future 100 years. There are more than 10.5 billion people that are going to be born in this century, and we need to start taking decisions that care about them. But here I have a question actually back to you, Jens, because you have been a politician, you have been in that budget process within your mandate period. So what if there would be an ombudsman for the future generations? You know, no one would elect that person. It would be someone who has that status in the society would say no to some of your budgetary expenditure because it would have negative future implications. How would you cope with that as a politician?
I can try to answer that, or perhaps also the other in the panel. But I think that the strength as a politician is that if you have engagement and statistics, if you can show that we are spending this money in a wrong way and this is the effect. So what we would need, and I also talk as an economist, we would need to have calculations that show that we are taking from the common public goods. And that is a lack in economist theory, I think, that we don't put in the figure of public goods. So I would then ask for statistics that really can see that we are taking from the next generation. And if I can do that in an honorable and transparent way, perhaps I could get voters to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And Johanna, what can a meeting like Stockholm plus 50 do when it comes to engagement and outcomes concerning these risks?
Thank you very much for the question, Jens. I was listening to Pelle, and you kind of want to pick up and react to all of the different things. So can I just do that before we come back to the question?
And you had more remarks, so
yes,
we will come back to it.
I will come back to it. I just kind of thinking of what you actually said on the important roles of those for us in the multilateral context that we very often also hear the blame of. But I'm thinking of the UNFCCC process, for example, with a very clear mandate, most often not the mandate that people on the street actually think that the process is doing. But at the same time, if it wasn't for that process, you wouldn't have seen, the moment in business, the moment in civil society, or the whole investment processes from the financial sectors. So that kind of iterative process of kind of pull and push between the multilateral system and other stakeholders is, I think, extremely, extremely important. So just kind of wanted to comment on that also. And then, looking at the opportunities of a meeting as Stockholm in the context of what has been discussed here this morning, I did feel in a way quite reassured that the thematics that we have chosen for Stockholm plus 50, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity, is very timely, and is also in a way, having that opportunity to address the risks in a different way than we do in other, and I'm kind of thinking now more on the multilateral system in the environment field. So there is a huge opportunity, both when it comes to engagement processes, in the sense of, we were talking about the youth, I could talk much more about that, but providing both the meaningful engagement from the youth, but also an honest and frank conversation with the youth, which I also think is important. It's very much that intergenerational discussion. Then also the whole framing of Stockholm. I was asked once to describe it with 3 I's: implementation, interconnectivity, intergenerational. So that I think is also picking up some of those discussions. And the last also on the outcome, which comes back a little bit to that kind of future perspective, giving a signal, what are the things we need to deal with for a better future, but also doing so in a way that we are not postponing our actions, but actually taking measures on the ground also.
Folke, from your perspective, do we have talked so much about these different risks. what do we need to handle them? What is the gap?
Well, some of the things that have been said here, I think, are important in addressing these issues. And let me just comment a little bit on the ombudsperson for the future and this whole perspective of the future. I mean, the idea here is that those people who will be mostly affected by our decisions today should have some sort of a say, some sort of an, obviously future generations can't vote, but they can have some sort of representation in not only, I think, in international organizations, but we should also think about that at the national level. And it's important also because it's, you talk about the youth, and this is kind of, I think, related to the idea that we should try to encourage young people to have a sense of agency here, more so than today, to give them some room for being engaged in this discussion. And that's an important signal that could promote also that sense of agency, I think. We need to discuss things like, should we lower voting age, for example, which they have done in some countries, Austria and Malta, and it has been on the agenda for the European Parliament for many years, and so on. So we need to get young people involved, or they are already, but we need to facilitate that process, I think.
Natalie, you were also one of the winners at the New Shape Prize, where you also had thoughts on giving young people more of a platform. But listening to this conversation, and you perhaps have been listening before, what do you see as the big gaps when it comes to solving this? Although we have also heard today, and I think that is important, that things are also achieved. We have to take that into account, because otherwise you would be depressed.
No, thank you, Jens, and absolutely, I think we have to, keep in mind that we have made progress on many fronts. But I mean, I bring today with me the perspective not just of the UN Association in the UK, but a network we have of about 200 or so civil society groups around the world, called the Together First Network, and also some of the work I did at the UN for its 75th anniversary, where we asked 1.5 million people in 195 countries what were their hopes and fears for the future. And I think what I took away from that process is really that sometimes the people are almost more advanced than we think they are. I mean, I do think we need to trust a little bit more that people have the capacity, to support action that may make them a little bit less comfortable now if they can see that as an investment in their future. And the 3 points that really came to my mind, having listened to, the discussion here in this panel and before, is that one, I think, to echo Augusto's point earlier, we really do need to get our act together in terms of preparedness. The international community is still very reactive and not proactive. And that is difficult. It is difficult to get member states, politicians to focus on things that might be, as you said, future generations don't vote, as Folke said. So I think, there's a lot that we know. We knew that a pandemic, of this sort could happen. We know the impacts of climate, because actually many people around the world are already feeling them. We know, for example, in an area like demographic change, that we're going to have a large youth generation that will give way to the largest generation of older people. And yet we are not taking the steps that we need to prepare for this. So I think this idea that the UN needs to step up and really be the provider of data and analysis. The UN is sitting on this huge treasure trove of information, and in an age where information is so contested, I really do think that is one of the best, if not global public goods, but services that the UN can provide. So I think the Secretary General's proposal needs to be taken seriously for the UN to step up in that field. But the second point was inequality. Within countries, between countries, and in terms of global burden sharing. And we need to look, at who is providing aid around the world, but also who is accepting refugees, and start seeing that in a much more equal manner. It is a pleasure to listen to Martin Rees. He's so eloquent and gentle in his, wisdom. But one of the points he made, that the UK is responsible for just 1% of emissions currently. if you said that in the General Assembly at the UN, you would not go down very well, because states there are thinking of the historical role, of the UK in contributing to emissions, and in fact the fact that it still outsources pollution and emissions to other countries. So I think we need to get much more comfortable with thinking in terms of solidarity, rights, fairness, or we won't get anywhere. COVID should have been that wake-up call. Nobody is safe until we all are. It doesn't look like it has been. I think climate change will be that wake-up call, but it's probably going to be too late then. And finally, my big lesson from the pandemic was that we seem to feel comfortable in certain types of solutions. So in the pandemic, it was, let's put our faith in, research and medicine and a vaccine. And for climate, technology will help us. And we don't do enough to challenge the systemic problems that we need to address. Otherwise, these sorts of problems will come up time and time again. So I think that is a huge challenge, and it's difficult to get the international community to do that. But we need to start thinking in terms of much more transformative change.
Mm. And talking about the international community, I have some questions here on multilateralism, and we often see then different states meeting at UN. But is the UN role also, does it need to shift to not only different states but different stakeholders? Because we know that there are some nations that are not interested in these roles, if they're binding or not. Is there a no role for the UN here?
But I think, and Natalie has been part of that process. There is definitely a new type of cooperation growing with more inclusive, more networked solutions to things and ambitions. So I think that is definitely an opening. And actually we. On the youth issue, which you brought up, Folke, just before the General Assembly, UN Foundation and a group of other big organizations came together and brought together a stronger coalition of youth. And we're working with member state champions and organizations to push this forward. So I think we'll have to see much more of that, where we don't stick to only 193 member states in the General Assembly. We need to find solutions outside that particular group.
Folke, how is...
No, just thinking on this question also, and again, I'm just taking the example of the UNFCCC process again, and it's the whole action agenda has really involved since Paris, and then you have all of the negotiators. I used to be a negotiator. I never ever made it actually to the action agenda. So we are trying to come together, but somehow the worlds are still a little bit separate. So I think there we all have to think, how do we actually find the opportunity not just to meet in the same place, but to actually talk to each other? Mm. And I was listening to you now also, and I have done quite a lot of youth dialogues over the year now on Stockholm Plus 50. And then I just realized, and I haven't really thought about it, but I think it has only been country representatives. So I think we also, maybe have a responsibility then to say what we would learn from our processes, and how can we then help to also shape a youth process where we avoid the silos from the beginning. Mm. So just kind of a reflection on that also. Mm.
Folke, how difficult is it to reach consensus or to move forward with these global catastrophic risks when there are fewer and fewer democracies?
That's obviously a big concern. But if we look, so now it doesn't look so great because we have problems for democracy across the world, even in well-established democracies, of course. But if you look, say, 50 years back, obviously it's a better situation now. So we don't really know where we're heading. I think that is a big problem for many reasons. We need to take action, and governments need to take action. And if countries develop in that direction and give room for corruption, for example, then that's going to be more difficult, and their citizens are not going to trust the governments and so on and so forth. that is also a problem, I would say, at the UN level. It sounds very good, and I think it is very good to allow other actors into the work at the UN to revitalize what is going on there. But on the other hand, we need to be a little bit cautious so that the UN's activities are not dominated by actors that are not, democratically elected or have no political legitimacy, because that might undermine kind of the legitimacy of the whole system. So it's a good process, I think, but it needs to be done with caution.
Mm-hmm. And another question is, and we're going to talk more about that tomorrow, the need for just transition. Natalie, how unjust is the transition today, and how much do we need to also? And I think Augusto Claris was talking about that in the risk index, that injustice is a threat in itself.
I totally agree with that. Trust, the lack of trust, inequality, injustice. This is sort of a risk factor, at least a risk enabler, I think, in itself, because everything becomes harder to address when you have these divisions. And it's a bit, what I was trying to say before. I mean, we focus on very specific solutions that don't look at the wider social economic context that is inherently unfair. So when we're looking at, climate, I still sit in so many meetings where the focus is very much on reducing emissions, funding technology, things that we're quite comfortable, I think, especially in rich countries to pursue. The uncomfortable, things that we need to talk about, the type of help. And I think Augusto mentioned it, that countries will need to be able to not do what we have done in the West and do it better and differently, but not feel like we're saying, well, you can't develop, we did, but sorry, you can't do it now. I think that's where we won't make progress until we overcome that. But I think what gives me hope is that if you ask people, as we did for the UN 75th, they don't think in terms of a climate agenda, an environment agenda, human rights agenda. They're sort of looking already much more holistically in terms of what needs to happen. So when you start really looking at things from a people-centered view, you ask them what hopes they might have for their children and grandchildren, you get a much better answer and you get much better solutions, I think, than when you look at it in very technical terms. And that sort of, if I can come back on the discussion we just had, because that was basically what my New Shape prize entry was all about. I think that's why you do need to have other stakeholders in the room, because you're not going to change those discussions unless you change the people who are in the room. The difficulty is how do you bring them in and also have some checks and balances. So I think we do need to, look at some of the interesting ideas in the Secretary General's proposal. One is on the issue of tech, having a global digital compact. So how can we give private sector, civil society, youth, and other actors a little bit more real decision making? But in exchange for that, they also have to take on some responsibilities, be open to, be much more transparent and accountable. So it's a sort of, discussion of, giving a little bit of power, in exchange for some bigger role in decision making. I think that will be a really interesting area to watch in the next few years.
Pelle?
No, but I agree fully with that. But I think the UN actually has prepared itself for this kind of discussion also at the country level, because in addition to what Natalie is saying, we need to bring these movements into the room, but we also need to bring the decisions down to the people. I mean, the UN has now reformed and has a more of a political role, I would say, at the country level with a new resident coordinator system, which is directly linked to the Secretary General. I think the UN at country level should start creating these debates, the platforms about the future that we need. There is one dilemma with that, and that's that the UN country offices, they are in the developing world. I think the UN should have offices in our countries, in Sweden and in the US and in the UK. And maybe, Natalie, your organization has a particular responsibility to bring these issues up. I think here in Sweden we don't talk very much about the SDGs in our budgetary discussion, and I would like that debate to happen here as well as it happens in countries in Africa or elsewhere where the UN actually can drive that agenda. So we have a responsibility here to do it in the developed world as well. I would just like to point to one other suggestion, which I think can also frame the discussion maybe tomorrow. The Secretary General is proposing to have a summit of the future in 2023, and he's going to put together a high-level advisory board that is going to prepare with ideas, especially focused on the global commons and global public goods. I think that 2-year stretch and that meeting will be very important, and I hope that as many as possible can engage in that process. It will be a little bit like the Brundtland Commission in the 1980s, which actually was the starter of this whole debate about SDG 17 with the Rio conference, and that then went on to the Millennium Development Goals. And so I think this is a chance, and we should all seize it.
And what mandate is he going to give to that group? Or?
Well, the mandate is in the report.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
As I said, it's going to come up with ideas on global governance of the global common goods. Of course, there's no mandate yet, and I think the Secretary General, as we're speaking, is looking at names on who to appoint in that panel. But it will be an important vehicle, and I think here a chance for all of you that are listening to engage and actually contribute to this process. I think that's the way for the next 2 years. That should be the focus.
Folke?
Well, just a comment on what Natalie said about this holistic approach. I'm glad. I think it's encouraging to hear that people, I mean, that's their view, basically. And I think that's exactly the right view, obviously, to have. And what that means is, I mean, and that holds for all these global risks, of course. They have implications in so many sectors and on so many levels. And we have to take all of them into account in a reasonable way. So one way of promoting preparedness is to promote, shall we say, coordination. And we really, there are so high demands of coordination right now in so many fields and cooperation. I could take Sweden's COVID response as an example, for example. When the pandemic hit Sweden, it wasn't clear which government agency should take the lead here, but ultimately it was decided that it would be the public health agency. But that was more like a random thing, actually, because eventually one learned, of course, that this does not only have implications for traditional public health issues, but economic, social implications, and so on and so forth. So not even a well-structured society like the Swedish one was really well prepared for governing this enormous thing that hit us. And we need to think about that also at the global level.
Right. And perhaps have some scenarios to see how we can, so it's not a random who is the first one to take that challenge.
No, I just wanted to come back. Both Pelle was speaking about our Common Agenda report and the opportunities, and there is also a mentioning of Stockholm plus 50 actually in the report, pointing to Stockholm plus 50 as an opportunity to redefine humankind's relationship to nature, which we, of course, is something that we hope that states and stakeholders will really seize that opportunity and bring it in as a component to our work for Stockholm plus 50. And then also just on the just transition that we spoke about, which always comes up in any conversation. I do notice, however, that the word just actually means different a little bit on where you are and where you place yourself. And I have also noted that sometimes, when you talk about the inclusive transition, it is actually in a way easier to get some understanding from certain countries in the sense of inclusive transition, leaving no one behind. And one of the things that comes up in my consultations with stakeholders, with states, as one key issue, if we are to succeed with the transition, with the implementation, with security issues, is the effects on the whole future jobs market, and how do we create, we are all saying that the transition can create millions of new jobs, but are we prepared for that? Are we, having the right skills for that? How do we work with reskilling? So I think that is actually part of the whole just and inclusive transition also, and just wanted to bring it up to the table to not create more risks for the future, which I think there's a risk of doing if you don't tackle that issue.
Natalie, do you want to comment on that?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and the point about the nomenclature is interesting. I think that's something as well we found in the UN 75 survey, that issues that people would describe as we would describe maybe as a climate or environmental or human rights issue, they were just people's problems. It was the challenges they faced in their daily lives. And I think one interesting area that we need to think about is to what extent, when it comes to GCRs, with risks, we can have proof of concept. So when we're looking at, this is the approach we're taking on the just transition, on the inclusive transition, actually having some pilots, in countries or in companies, in organizations that can actually say, look, we're going to walk you through. This is what a just transition looks like. This is how we're going to reskill. It can work. I think also there'll be much more trust, I think, if we can start almost piloting and implementing projects that we need to do, instead of waiting until we absolutely have to do them, because that's the only way we're going to get the buy-in, I think, to make some of the difficult decisions, because there's always going to be some trade-offs, and we need to prove that ultimately we can look after people if we get it, if we get it right. I think that's what people need to see now. It's too theoretical in many ways.
I have one question here, and that is if you have any thoughts of strategies to help me out of a very nationalistic discussion into more of a world citizenship where we can solve these things together. Do you have any advice to such a question? Folke. Because I mean there is such a rhetoric around in Europe and all over the place that is strong and successful.
At one level that is happening. I think there are lots of things that are happening in our societies at different levels and so on. But I mean there has been a growing awareness for many decades of the fact that we are interconnected over the globe, and that we have more reasons to take people from other countries into consideration, and also now future generations and even in some cases non-human animals and so on. And I have great hopes that circle is going to continue to widen. And once that happens, the national borders are becoming less relevant, especially now when we know that the decisions we take within a country can have enormous implications for citizens and people in other countries, without them having any influence over our decisions.
One way to have an influence there is, of course, to have also courts that could be on a more global level and strengthen them. And I know in 1972, 50 years ago, Olof Palme, he used the word ecocide. Will 2022 also talk about these kinds of institutions and the strength of institutions to sort out conflicts like Folke was mentioned?
I think we're probably not going to be able to sort out all of the conflicts. But, with the fundament in the 1972 principles, in the strong messages now out from the Human Rights Council last Friday, the rights issue, the ecocide issue, is something that we see feature more and more in the kind of suggestions coming from civil society on what should be on the agenda for Stockholm Plus 50, because we don't have that very limited agenda. We have a wide agenda, and some of the key issues are, for example, environmental defenders and the situation for them, the jobs that we already talked about. Some are also bringing up the nexus, conflict prevention, environment and climate. So I think, these issues, you can't really pay tribute to 1972 without addressing these issues in one way or another. And I think we are now in the stage of somehow framing how that would be.
But I have a comment on this nationalistic versus international, and I'm struck by the discussion here in Sweden. When we are facing this transition into a climate fossil-free industry and nation, suddenly we're going to produce all our energy internally in Sweden. And for the last 150 years, we have been importing a huge amount of energy. So that I think there's a tendency when you go into this transition that you look internally and you build nationally, but actually, and we will hear more about that tomorrow, I think, about a global alliance on green hydrogen. I think that's a good example where we can start creating new international cooperation around these items that we need for the transition. And instead of becoming independent on all energy issues in Sweden, we should actually start importing some of the energy. I think that's the new global network that needs to grow.
As we do in some, with the European exchange and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll come back to that. I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you here in the sofa. And I would like to you in the sofa to stay a little bit because we are going to have our next sessions. But I would like to say thank you to you, Natalie. Very interesting to hear you, and I'm very happy that we can cooperate. And you are also have formed the civil society movement Together First that are also holding a lot of this debate and giving voices to people around the globe. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I thought we would have